what it's supposed to, I think, you know, one message is, why are they afraid of us? They're the ones with all the power. They're the ones with all the money. They're the ones with the police force working for them. Why is it that they're afraid of black men? And then the other, and this is a comical gesture, he says, I don't know, maybe it's because we got the guns, and he goes, you're right, and they pull out their guns, and they, you know, carjack. Do you remember that scene? You know, I mean, so it's like, yeah, two guys with guns can steal the car of the assistant district attorney and create havoc momentarily, but in the end, actually, one of them dies from a gun, and the other one is trying to live less violently. So I think what she's trying to do is to salvage some notion of nonviolent political action, but it's very idealistic. And it's very idealistic because, and the example I'm thinking of to just throw on the table is, okay, Gandhi maybe knew his enemy, knew that the English were maybe unlikely to slaughter him, that they had some kind of conscience about someone starving to death on their doorstep, or...
Could that perhaps be the difference between totalitarianism and whatever they were up against?
Yeah, yes, that they were maybe in the same world politically, even if England had power and India didn't. But what about terrorists that we now face? You know, what can we, and I don't know what this group thinks about the relationship. Do you agree with Hannah Arendt that pure political action is always nonviolent? That when you turn to violence, you're relinquishing political action and relinquishing the possibilities of freedom. You can never get freedom from violence. All you can get is a momentary victory, and then people start gunning for you. Does that make sense?
Well, I tend to agree. I mean, because one of her major tenets is that, like you said, war is an extension of politics, it's a breakdown. So if war, in the big sense, is a breakdown of politics, like in the public sense, I guess, is the violence, let me just start over. If violence or war in the public world is the breakdown of the public world, then wouldn't violence, like on a personal level, also be the breakdown of political action? Because you have the political realm in a big sense, and you have the political action in the individual, group, or private sense. And if the breakdown in one results in violence, and a breakdown in the other would also result in violence.
That's the question you just posed. Is one of the problems that I have sometimes with Arendt. I feel like in the local level, or on a smaller level, I completely agree with her. Once you go into international relations, I don't know if I do, because you know, like, I don't know that many people that aren't, or that many political science professors, for example, that aren't in international relations at least, somewhat realists, and that you know.
Realist? What's that? Is that the word? I heard.
Sorry, what?
Realist?
Realist.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where it always comes to, is, you know, get real. That the world is violent.
And you know, sometimes I do agree, you know, in the big sense, with the, you know, I can't remember what theory said, war is politics with what is it? Wars is politics, but with different means. So I feel that sometimes it is, and you know.
But I think with Arendt, she's a theorist. She's not saying that this is how it's going to work. She's saying that if in an ideal world or in a theoretical world, this is how it should work. But I don't think she's saying that this is how it has to be or how it should be, but how it ought to be.
Saying it should.
Look on. Well, I think.
Very concerned with action.
Yeah, I think it's more than that, actually. I think she wants to save the world.
But I mean, taking it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go. Well, I think that the one quote that's similar to what you just said is on, if we look at page 111, where she kind of sets up her argument. and talks about war, and she's quoting, what is she quoting? Engels. War itself is the basic social system within which other secondary modes of social organization conflict or conspire. Or war is an extension of diplomacy, and peace is the continuation of war by other means. And what, you know, she's saying this is what we've come to, but if we understand what freedom is, we may be in a position to preserve it. But the question of realism, I think, is really important. And that's, let me suggest two things, and then let me shut up and see if you guys can run with this. The two things I'm suggesting is examples of one. Does this work internationally, or does it work, for example, I mean, we have a very, I don't know if it's a powerful enemy, but we've got a really scary, violent enemy in international terrorism. I mean, people who are clearly willing to kill non-combatants, innocents, to invade public spaces, to make it unsafe to be out in public. If you think that bombs are going to go off and there are going to be terrorist attacks at any minute, I mean, that is an obliteration of the boundary between public and private. If you're not safe in public because you might get blown up and so you get chased back into your household, I mean, that's a victory for totalitarianism. So given what we seem to know about terrorists who are prepared to destroy civilians and say that all of us are culpable as Americans and we're infidels, or whatever else extremists are prepared to say, is there any way to combat that isn't going to war against them? In other words, is Arendt really off base here? Just giving us a kind of fantasy or a dream. Right, that's that's one way to go. The other is to try to bring Reich back in here and to say, if another, I want to say enemy, but maybe not, is the 1%.
I'm sorry.
Is is that, how is that combated? And if the 1%, and forgive me for manipulating this a little bit, is in part responsible for the manifesto that you guys are writing and the political campaign that you are, attempting to save public education for people without much money, is there any kind of comparison between the two battles, between the political action you've chosen and the political action that might be necessary or available to us in the face of a violent enemy like extremist Muslim terrorism?
I think one of the things that I notice is that violence is so much more poignant, and it's more liable to create some sort of a social change out of it. And just knowing about how much more exposure that violence can get, I think this last weekend in San Francisco, a bunch of Occupy protesters went through and smashed up a bunch of businesses and cars, and that got front page attention, whereas a lot of the protests weren't. And I think that violence can be some sort of a sounding board. I don't know if it's an exact political action, but I think that it has a certain effect at the very least, and it can't be discounted.
Well, and I don't know if that's for the best, because I'm thinking about Arendt saying action without speech is only gonna give you achievements and nothing really, it's just gonna be the means to the end. And so if you think about it in terms of the Occupy movement and the 1%, if you go to violence, past the peaceful protesting and the assembling, which I think Arendt would prefer, or what she would say was the best way to go about it. If you go past that and just be violent and cause so get attention that way, and then even if it ends up getting the goal that the Occupy movement wanted from the 1%. They lost their dignity and their togetherness by doing that, and they kind of like, it just lost all of its meaning, I think, too, because it's just like she said, it's like making it's just the same thing as producing like the production of an object, you know. It's not the like process of going about it and like the meaning, the symbolism of it, and it's just like, okay, yeah, you won, but what does that mean? You know?
But I mean, they still accomplished their goals even if it was through violence, and wouldn't that the ultimate goal for them?
What's the goal?
Or like for the Occupy, if they wanted whatever their idea was, if they actually accomplished it through violence, then how is that not the same thing? Yes, it may not have the same.
Would it be
like,
sustained accomplishment?
It may be. I don't know if it would actually be sustained, but just saying theoretically, if it was accomplished, how is that any worse of a meaning than if they did it peacefully?
I think that in terms of like taking that like question in terms of the war and the violence, if she says like if you use the violence and you win a war because you didn't go through the peaceful talks and negotiations that you could have by just using your voice. So yeah, you won your war that you got into, but then I think that from what I got from her, is that she says that it's going to lead to another war, and it's just going to be another list of accomplishments that you won all these wars on, and it's just going to keep on happening with different enemies or different opposition. But if you actually take the time and go through it peacefully, then you might, not necessarily, I don't know if she expects it to end all future conflicts, but it might stop the process of just war, making war, starting a new one.
I think that relates to our situation a lot, because I think a lot of people take for granted the fact that, like we go over there and we bomb them and we kill people, and, it's not like we're the only ones that get bombed and then have innocent people die. It's like a back and forth thing, And I think a lot of people, even before 9/11, who are sort of aware that something like this could happen, because that's what happens when, your brother gets blown up or your father does. You grow up and you're hateful, and you probably want violence.
And I think that's the point of not doing the Occupy movement violently, is that it's the same thing that Todd's saying. You just perpetuate this process where maybe you're the victor now, but somebody's going to be pissed for you killing their family or changing the rules, and it's just going to perpetuate another Occupy, but seeking the opposite goals. And then maybe they went through violence, and it's just like this, cycle. But if you do it non-violently, does that mean that there's not going to be a conflict? No, but that does mean that you haven't perpetuated the cycle, so that you put a stopping point in that, and it would have to start all over again through new means.
Well, and I think that if you in terms of the Occupy movement going violent, and by doing that, they would lose their, credibility and their, I don't know, dignity amongst the people who aren't in the movement, just watching from the outside, but still in the public, and so they would see it as, that would, I think, affect the outcome, even if the Occupy, what got their goal accomplished by going to violence. So you could say what does it matter if you go violent or not, but the people outside the situation could look at it being well, we don't even know, if they even said anything, or if they just wanted to be violent. They got their stuff, so it could affect future things.
In other words, if they're not being articulate, if they're just smashing things.
Yeah, because I think that's what she talks about in the human condition of when she's talking about the action and speech, is that if you're just being violent and just using your words as propaganda, or to, like she says, dazzle your enemy or something, then instead of actually for something that you believe in and trying to spread the message that you believe in, or try to actually make progress with their enemy based on what they believe in, then it just turns in, even though you're still fighting for your interest, it loses its meaning in terms of outside of the meaning.
I will agree in that most of the time she's right in that using force, you're losing your political action. I think though there's specific times that, for example, people getting together to give police legitimate use of force. I think you are making a political statement in that you're, a society, you're agreeing that, police can use force in order to, can use violence against certain people in order to uphold a principle that you have agreed to, for example, or for example, going to war against Hitler. I think it is a political action that you're taking. So I think there's specific scenarios in which Arendt might be wrong.
It almost sounds like Socrates. It sounds like the kind of the do no harm thing. I mean, when are you justified to use force?
Yeah, when are you
Use
justified?
violence.
That's a really good question. Like, Arendt certainly wouldn't have thought that Gandhi would have been effective against Hitler. But, and I don't know if, if a defensive war is okay in her terms. I think, it looks to me like it's a good point, she is talking about domestic disputes here. I was kind of thinking in response to what Brian was saying about how if the Occupy movement won by using force, what's the difference? Winning is good.
Isn't it like the French Revolution had
goals. I mean,
I think of like Tale of Two Cities, where they track down the aristocrats and they chop all their heads off. That could very well be the 99% chopping off the heads of the 1%.
What does winning look like?
But I think in that situation they better be ready to move on from that win and accept the because if they get that win, it's like, oh yeah, we won against 1%, and then everyone's like, okay, what are you gonna do now? And it's like, I think
she talks about technology has made it almost impossible for revolution because the government always has more weapons than people do. So I don't know if there's going to be a French Revolution-esque thing, but
even if they chose to use violence.
I don't even know if that's possible.
Well, I was just thinking that might be parallel.
Yeah, I don't
No,
know.
but that's good, because I was actually thinking that with Brian too, okay, they win, but I'm looking at did you mean locally, okay, we got on the news? Or is winning, is it gonna be something more like Marx?
I don't even know winning.
yeah.
Does anyone, I don't know, you guys
You're
know,
more everyone knows that was more like that.
I don't know, what would you guys say winning for the Occupy movement would be, or something, or just
I thought it was just to inspire everyone. Violence is
And if it
inspiring,
is
so I
something
don't know if their goals are with the rest of the group and the occupiers.
And is that something that you can ever know that you achieve fully?
That's what's crazy about the Occupy movement as well. It's it's too broad to ask that sort of question. It's more what is Occupy Reno doing, or what is this particular town doing? I don't know, at this point, I don't know a whole lot about it, but it doesn't seem like there's one single thing that they're all going for, but there are these groups of people all around. So perhaps Occupy being successful is having more political action, whatever that means in particular communities, in areas. Because, I don't know, it seems to me that there's a whole lot of different attitudes. Perhaps, Oakland, they have one set of things they want to take back with schools and things like that. And here I know I've met a lot of people that want to end corporate personhood and repeal that, what is that, Citizens United. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like it's pretty hard to say what is success for the Occupy movement without breaking it down into these smaller groups.
Yeah, I was just saying a broad hypothetical, take one goal and they actually accomplished it through violence. What is the difference? That was all I was thinking.
Oh,
Not
sorry,
that
I don't know.
they're all of these, because
Well,
there is no real.
Is violence masculinist? Is violence about, is it something guys do?
I think that'd be hard to
No,
say.
I'm looking at the men,
I learned
it's
about
not all
it.
men, but I mean, is it about?
There's a culture in China that I learned about in one of my women's studies classes. Supposedly it's the only matriarchy ever, right? And they don't even have a word for war. And women call all the shots.
I don't know if we've had enough societies with women in charge
Yeah.
for us to tell.
Well, also it's still masculinist because women aren't allowed to fight on the front lines, the men are in the U.S. at least. So I mean, you have to say, it is, at least in that sense.
Well, that's war. That's military.
Well,
That's
I mean, I
a
guess
narrow definition of violence.
Yeah, I guess
certainly.
it's not all violence. I was just thinking about war, but I think that
Proof of
maybe
point.
that also, I think that also that might just also affect the masculinity of violence in general too, because it's the ultimate violence is the war.
Also, if you put a female in charge of war or whatever, they automatically assume they have to act like the male counterparts and be masculine about it. So they might be personally against war, but they think because that's how it's been done before, and the men that were successful before her did it that way, they would continue to do it that way.
Or they don't wanna look weak.
Yeah,
Like they don't
because
wanna
you
look
would get
feminine.
attacked.
Yeah, and discredit themselves for not doing it the way the men did it before.
And that the threat is, I don't know, but I'm suggesting maybe the threat is to the manhood of a nation. You know, I mean, when the black power movement arose, when the student movement got violent, this is, you know, kind of late 60s, early 70s, it was pretty explicitly about reasserting masculinity. And the black feminist movement grew out of that, as some of you have been with me as we've studied, that, you know, that freedom shouldn't have been about black masculinity defending itself against white force and violence in that way.